Good morning, good morning, good morning, and welcome once more to Doulab Beyond, the podcast where we analyze future trends and where we prepare ourselves to build a better present. My name is Luis Santiago, and I have the privilege of accompanying you guys and girls today. So first thing first, if you have listened to this podcast before, now suddenly you find yourself with me speaking English. So let me explain a little bit about this. So the past few weeks, I've been analyzing and we've been analyzing data and analytics of this podcast. As you remember, our first edition, we said the podcast is going to be experimental. So we're going to be testing with our audience to see what makes sense, what doesn't make sense. And we realized two things. First, most people that are listening to this podcast, most of them are native English speakers or are English speakers, even if it is a second language. So for us, obviously, that it's very important that we have that in mind because our goal is to have a podcast that can reach as many people as possible. If we are to reach our goal of you know preparing people with future literacy, right? Teaching people about the future and how to deal with the future and the changes that are going to be coming. So as we did that, we realized, well, the thing is, if we have a Spanish-speaking podcast, that's all good and great for our Spanish-speaking audience, but it leaves out, and we're not being inclusive, with the people that can listen to the podcast in English. Most Spanish speaking audiences interested in this kind of topics speak English. But most of the people interested in this topic that speak English as a native language, they don't speak Spanish. So we were leaving people out and we want to be as inclusive as we can. So for that reason, and obviously we are still going to be testing this, we decided to record moving forward, to record in English and see where that leads us. Having said that, this is also the first time we are recording with video as well. So we're recording both in audio and video at the same time. So, and we are mixing live. So bear with us. We know the audio is going to be great, uh, but bear in mind that if you see some glitches, we decided to mix live, and so we don't have to edit as much, and we can produce this podcast even faster. Now, having said all of this, I want to introduce our topic for today, which is the hyperconvergence of exponential technologies. Now, we have been talking about this topic for a while now, and if you listen to the podcast season from this season, which is chapter 1, 2, and 3, this is chapter 4 or episode 4. We've been talking about the hyperconvergence of exponential technologies. We've touched upon that a little bit, and we have said, it's this moment in time where technology is moving so fast that ideas from one field are mixing with ideas from other fields incredibly fast, and now people are able to develop and prototype solutions at a speed that it's absolutely outstanding, right? And we wanted to touch upon this a little bit more today because we've been talking about this for more than a year now, but we haven't shared these thoughts with a broader audience, just a few talks here and there. But today we wanted to go deeper on that. And this talk that I developed last year, Hyperconvergence of Exponential Technologies, goes way deeper and than what been able to talk about in the previous episodes. So we wanted to explain to you guys where this idea of hyperconvergence comes from. It's not necessarily a new concept, the convergence aspect of it, the velocity, the speed. Yes, that's essentially a new concept. So let's talk about where is hyperconvergence leading us and where does it come from. So let's reach out and move forward. So let's do this. So, most people tend to evaluate their present in the future with the tools that they have right now, right? You think about where is my company going? Well, you have a framework, you have your strategic planning. The thing is, and this is one example, the thing is, most of the tools that we use to evaluate potential futures, because unfortunately things are moving so fast, they tend to become obsolete incredibly fast, which means by the time you analyze a potential future, you're probably analyzing that future with a tool that is already disrupted. And what do I mean by that? Well, the thing is, we right now we don't have tools that are able to keep up with the changes. Bear in mind that I mean mind tools, frameworks that are able to adapt to the changes that we're seeing at the speed that we need them to change. So what we need right now, it's of course better tools. We need tools that adapt to the changes, that adapt to the future. How do you build those tools? Well, we need to understand the past. We need to be able to learn from the past so we can make tools that can predict, adapt, and help us create better futures. So, okay, Luis, that's all good and fine, but how do you do that? How do you build those tools? Well, today's topic, hyperconvergence, is about that. It's about how do you understand what's happening and the speed with which everything is moving so we can create tools that allow us to adapt to an ever-changing reality, an ever-changing future. So let's dive in. So to do that, we need to start talking about the convergence hypothesis. And what is the convergence hypothesis? When I was thinking about this last year, I had a thought, which was, well, is it knowledge that allows a society to create economic growth? Or is it economic growth that allows for more knowledge to be introduced to that society? And as I was thinking about this and going a little bit deeper into these thoughts, I realized, you know what? And I'm sorry if you see this. I am actually making sure that we have enough light. So this is recorded live, and I want to thank you for bearing with me. Yeah, I wanted to make sure that you guys can see me a little bit more. So I was saying, is it knowledge that allows for society to grow, or is it growth that brings in more knowledge? Well, as I was thinking, I realized, well, it's both. It's a two-way street. The more knowledge you have, and the more you use that knowledge, right, to develop new technologies, new tools, to develop products, to develop services, that's also going to introduce more knowledge. So it's a positive cycle that allows a society to become better and better. And as I'm thinking about this, I found a report by the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, and so there were these two guys, Marvin Goodfriend and John McDermott, and they did a study, and they realized in the study, as an economy interacts with other economies, interestingly, their products start to converge. So let's say that you're building a boat, right? You're building a boat because you have a need to transport yourself in your country that has a specific characteristics, right? So you build a boat for yourself. But as soon as you start selling this boat to other countries, the boats those countries build, they're gonna look like yours. And so what tends to happen is, if you are not developing a technology in your own society, but you import it, as soon as you start building this kind of technology, it's going to look like what others are building. But as time moves on, you're going to start specializing that technology with new concepts, new ideas that are specific to your society. What that means is several generations forward, what you're building is probably going to be way, way different than what everybody else was building. And think about this for a second, because this is exactly what some countries are doing with, for example, exponential technologies like artificial intelligence, right? Think China. China was not a leader in artificial intelligence even 10, 20 years ago. But what they're doing now is moving so fast that they're developing new technologies and new techniques that no one else is doing. So how is artificial intelligence going to look if it comes from China 10, 20 years from now? Because they've been focusing on a very specific type of artificial intelligence, which is obviously on very specific types, way related to search, monitoring people, obviously, and monitoring faces, and you know what I mean. So how does that look? What can they achieve that other economies, other countries are not doing? So this is a very interesting topic to dive in. So let's go back to this conversation where convergence started to happen many centuries ago. Before the Industrial Revolution, everyone was doing their own thing. Everyone was basically having a subsistence economy, right? Obviously, I'm not going to go into the Mayans, I'm not going to go into the Egyptians, so big societies that were obviously developing things that affected a lot of people around the world. But most of the world was focusing on themselves. You know, countries were focusing on themselves. They were growing, but not massively. But as soon as we started to grow into the Industrial Revolution, the world changed incredibly fast. And something that I want to call a global convergence started to happen, and it was about to reshape everything. And so I want to think about the industrial revolutions, and I'm going to be referring to the industrial revolutions as global convergences. So for this part of this conversation, every industrial revolution, to me, it's now a global convergence. So let's dive in. So first global convergence, or the first industrial revolution, as you recall, it was a transition, right? It was a transition from the typical subsistence agriculture that you were doing before, now moving to a more industrialized production. It started in Great Britain, obviously happened in the United States, and started about 1760 all the way to 1820, 1840. And what's interesting about the Industrial Revolution is that for the first time in history, not only two big countries were doing the same thing at the same time, but also many other countries started to follow in their footsteps. And there were specific factors that facilitated the industrialization in the industrial revolutions. And I want to talk about those factors a little bit. Also, I want to, if you're taking notes, I want you to be mindful of these 6 factors, because we're going to apply them later on to see how the same 6 factors that facilitated the industrial revolutions, what first, second, third, they're the same 6 factors that facilitate the 4th industrial revolution and beyond. So let's talk about the first one, which is high levels of agricultural productivity. As we moved, right, to industrialization, now societies were able to have excess food. And what did they do with this food? Obviously, they had to do something, right? If you are, for example, producing 120% of your consumption, you need to do something with that 20%, right? To sell it to others. So now, if you're really good at, let's say, producing corn, and your neighboring country is not good at that, well, guess what? You need money, they need corn, you sell the corn. Everybody wins. And because of this, because the fact that you're now being better at producing corn, you're using your resources better. Now something else very interesting happens, which is the second factor. Now you liberate a lot of resources, a lot of people that were working in the fields. Now they're replaced by machines, right? Those people that can now specialize, and they can now, for example, study. They can do something else. They're not tied to the land necessarily. Now you have a pool of managerial skills. These people that were working in the land can now supervise others using those machines. They can now have their own piece of land. They can now develop their own entrepreneurial skills, which is very interesting. But now you're producing a lot more than what you were producing before. So now you need to move that production somewhere else, right? Because you're not only producing for you, you're producing for your city, you're producing for your state, you're producing for your country or other countries. So now ports, rivers, canals became available. And people started thinking about, well, we need to move this. They started to build roads to cheaply move those raw materials and those outputs. Also, all of this required energy, right? You needed that production needed energy to be produced, but you needed energy to move that production somewhere else. So natural resources, there was more demand for coal, more demand for iron. Waterfalls started to become exploited because now people said, well, we need energy. We need to, there's a river here. Let's do something with that water moving, right? But also political stability. People started to think not about subsistence, but more about existence, right? Political stability, legal systems that support businesses started to appear and become more prevalent. And let's talk about, this one is very important, financial capital. Because as soon as you covered your own needs, if you had more money, you start to think, well, what am I going to do with this money? Well, you invest in something else. And this also started to become a reality. So again, I'm gonna say really quickly, high levels of agricultural productivity, a pool of managerial entrepreneurial skills, a means to transport that production somewhere else, energy, right? Natural resources to create energy, to move, to produce, to power those machines, right? To power that industrialization. A political system that was more stable, that supported businesses and financial capital. Those six factors enabled the first industrial revolution. So how does that look for future industrial revolutions? Let's look at it. And again, remember, we're gonna be talking about the six factors at the end of the conversation as well. So once Great Britain and the United States accelerated their growth, many countries started to follow. And this is what I meant before. It was not, well, this society, it's growing. No, it's not only that. It's that many countries saw the example and said, yeah, let's do the same. And that led to the second global convergence, the second revolution, the technological revolution. Because that second industrial revolution meant that we now saw a lot of rapid scientific discovery, a lot of standardization, a lot of mass production. And this happened between the late 19th century all the way to the early 20th century. So we saw, right, in 1900, 22 countries achieving major turning points. Remember, we also had, a little bit further down the line, right, we also had a world war. But in part, it was caused by this rapid growth that many countries achieved in this first part of the 19th century. So we had advances in manufacturing, we had advances in production technology, and this enabled the widespread adoption of things like the railroad, telegraph networks. We saw cities becoming having better health because now they have water supplies that are filtered, that are cleaner, sewage systems, right? The Romans invented it thousands of years before, but now we started to see those same advances happening elsewhere in the world. And so we now see the production of iron, right? We had new techniques for the production of iron, new techniques for the production of steel. All of them together allowed the construction of the railroad network, right? Obviously, first one happened in Dark Hill Iron Works and then Cambria Iron Works. But this is the first time that we see railroad networks. Then we see electrification. We see, for example, Michael Faraday discovered the electromagnetic field. Then the first incandescent bulb, first power station, first successful DC motor. We see people building machinery, machine tools. We see paper making. And so these kind of advances start to create what we know today as the foundation of our modern society. From there, we move to chemical. We now have petroleum for the first time. We are able to mine the earth and extract petroleum. We didn't have any use for it yet, but eventually, soon enough, we were going to have a use for it. Synthetic dye, then maritime technology, right? The screw propeller, the surface condenser, the oscillating engine. Boats started to become these huge machines that were able to transport people all around the world way, way, way faster and way, way cheaper. Then we see the fertilizer, right? We see engines and turbines being built as well. So things are becoming better and better, faster and faster. We see rubber, right? The vulcanization of rubber becomes a milestone in society. Charles Goodyear, yeah, of course, the Goodyear tire. Charles Goodyear creates the process of the vulcanization of rubber, and we see the first practical pneumatic tire. From there, Harry John Lawson says, well, if I use a tire with this thing, oh, this is a bike. And from there, Carl Benz and Henry Ford were thinking, how did you make this into a vehicle? And now you have the first vehicle. And so if you see, things are going to be influenced by, or things are being influenced by the technology that came before. And it seems obvious now, but it's not necessarily that obvious because there was so much time passing between inventions, they didn't realize it. But then you have telecommunications, right? The first commercial telegraph system, because the world was becoming so big, now you had issues. How do you communicate with others so great distances, right? The first commercial telegraph system. And we see the first telegraph cable across the Atlantic Ocean, the first telephone. Maxwell unifies light, electricity, and magnetism through Maxwell electromagnetic theory. Now we know light, electricity, and magnetism, they have a base in the speed of light, a common framework, if you will. And all of this brings us to the third global convergence, the digital revolution. And why was the digital revolution so important? Well, because this is a time where we're shifting from mechanical technology to analog electronic technology, and eventually to digital electronics, right? We started with mechanical, then analog, now digital. And this third convergence was about to make things explode massively. Let's dive in again. So I want to go back to what Jeremy Rifkin in his book, The Third Industrial Revolution, he said, you want to think about revolutions, you need to think about the convergence of things, right? You need to think about new communication technologies, new sources of energy, and new modes of transportation. To him, this is what defines an industrial revolution. You see new communication technologies, you see new sources of energy, you see new modes of transportation. These are the three things that to humans are potentially the most important. How to move the production, how to power whatever is going to be used to move that production, how you communicate with others long distances and as fast as possible. And so what defines this era is the transistor. John Bardeen and Walter Hauser-Brattain created a germanium-based point contact transistor. This was created at Bell Labs. And if you know your history, eventually you will see at some point someone saying, how did you take this one simple piece of technology, transistor, and you put a lot of other transistors in the same place? Well, Robert Noyce started to think about this at Fairchild Semiconductor in 1959. Robert Noyce, among others, then left Fairchild and created Intel, so monolithic integrated circuit chip. Of course, semiconductor technology was the basis for the space race and the world that we know now today. Eventually, 1969, ARPANET was created, and then in 1989, because of ARPANET, right, influenced the creation of the World Wide Web, the invention of the internet. Now things are looking more like the world we know. Eventually, in 1989, of course, the mainstream creation of our modern era, Web 1.0 by Tim Berners-Lee, was created, right? And knowledge was now moving literally at the speed of light. And this moment is as important as the Gutenberg press in the 1500s, okay? It's as important because now knowledge is available in the palm of your hand, both metaphorically and literally. And so at this point, we're arriving to new modes of communication, new modes of transportation, and new technologies with new sources of energy. And now we now create an abundance of resources. And this is what I want to call the hyper-convergence revolution. So, the fourth industrial revolution, what defines it, there are many ways of defining it. One of them is the fact that there are so rapid changes to technology, to industries, to the way we see society, and the way we see our human processes, that we now think about as, I want to go back to what Klaus Schwab always says, not changing necessarily our environment, right? But changing ourselves. And this is the first time in history where this is obviously happening. And so we have to talk about the exponential technology at this point, because even though we did have exponential technologies before, but what we understand as exponential technologies in our modern mind is one that doubles their capability or their performance over a very, very, very short period. And this is, again, what powers this fourth industrial revolution. And I have to talk about what this guy says. Again, the CEO of the World Economic Forum. We are seeing changes coming so fast and changes that are so profound, right? Then from the perspective of human history, we now have the ability to create great promise or create great peril. And here's the thing. There are two ways of thinking about the future. You can be either an optimist or you can be a pessimist. I have to say that me personally, I am optimist by nature, but as an engineer, I'm not going to say pessimist, I'm going to say at some point kind of risk tolerant or risk adverse in some things. So you're going to see that my opinions are going to have are going to reflect both sides of the coin. I'm going to be cautiously optimistic about the future, but also very excited about the promise that the future brings. So bear with me as we keep moving, forward with this conversation. So the fourth industrial revolution is brought in because of the accelerated pace of change. We can draw a line. Ray Kurzweil taught us in The Singularity is Near that we can draw a line between exponential technologies 25,000 years ago, even 100,000 years ago, all the way to today. The only thing that was different was because it was, or the only thing that we need to remember is that changes were so slow before because we didn't have that much communication between our societies. And so obviously, this affected how fast we were able to bring a change, to bring new technologies online. Ray also talks about this in The Age of Spiritual Machines. He says the tendency for advances to feed on themselves, increasing the rate of further advance and pushing well past what one might sensibly project by linear extrapolation of current progress. What that means basically is saying if you build something, you're building that on top of old technology. The new technology that comes after you is going to be on top of you. So you're always going to see new technologies coming in online faster and faster and faster. Why? Because your foundation is something that came just before you, that was already faster, better, and cheaper than the one before. So every time you build something on top of something, especially if it is in exponential technology, in information-based technology, it's always gonna be improved and accelerated by Moore's law, right? Every generation of technology is gonna be twice as fast, twice as cheap as the one before. And this is the law of accelerating returns. The returns brought in by new innovation, it's always gonna be more than the one before. Just explain that in simpler terms. So we also have to think about the difference between linearity and exponentiality. Most humanity thinks in a linear way, right? Why? Because we evolved to think about our daily, immediate, present, and visible threats. But because technology moves in exponential steps, initially, these steps are going to be imperceptible, right? You were going to see advances happening in decades or centuries. But as soon as society started to communicate between themselves, as soon as technology started converging, you start to see things moving way, way faster. And this generates chaos, this generates surprise. Peter Diamandis, in his book, well, he's talked about this in all his books at this point, but especially in Abundance, he talks about the 6Ds framework. And this framework allows you to think about the future and about the present as well. Once the technology becomes digitized, it jumps on the speed of Moore's law. It digitizes, then it becomes deceptive. Growth becomes deceptive, right? New versions of the same technology, they tend to be really disappointing the first few iterations, right? There's a very specific graph that I used to show where the first 3, 4, 5 iterations of a technology, normally they're really not as interesting as the fifth version, then becomes exponential. But from there you move to disruption, and from disruption you move to demonetization, right? That technology becomes demonetized. That's why I am recording in high definition with a camera. Was one using television studios costing $25,000-$50,000. This one is really way cheaper than that. I'm not gonna say how much, but it's way cheaper than that. From there, you dematerialize things, right? The camera itself disappears. It becomes a sensor, and then it becomes democratized. I can reach the world with a podcast using technologies that other people built for me, and now my knowledge, what I want to provide to the world, can reach a global audience by the cost of the energy used to record and transmit this through the internet. And this is the 6Ds framework, one way of looking at the world, right? So what lies ahead? I want to start to wrap this up a little bit. What lies ahead? What can we do with all these ideas that I've shared with you people, beautiful, beautiful people today? We can build potential futures, as long as potential good futures, as long as we have an impactful purpose. So let's talk about that a little bit more. So now we lie at a fork in the road because we are at a moment in time where we see a lot of people that are building amazing things that are changing the world for the better, but we also see a lot of disruption happening that has a lot of people being really scared about the future, right? We see a lot of people being threatened by changes that are happening so incredibly fast that literally they don't know what to do with these changes. So what do we do? Well, first we need to change our mindset. Here's the problem. Most organizations and most people tend to think about what they do as the law of the land, right? This is how we've done it. This is how it's going to stay. This is how I want it to stay. The immune system of our organization, the people that have been there since the beginning or have been doing things in a way since a long time, they always say, we've always done it this way. We can afford to fail. This investment is costly. Why change it if it works? You have to hear all of this. So the immune system attacks the innovative mindset. This is a problem because if you don't change the way your organization thinks, you are not going to innovate. And why do we think the way we think? Well, remember, we evolved to be mindful of potential threats. And if you think about this, we were thinking about not being eaten, right, by a bear, by a tiger, whatever. We didn't want someone else to attack us and plunder our resources. At the beginning, it was obviously animals, but then it became other people. So we evolved by thinking I have to be careful with who I share my resources, my ideas, what I have. And if you are born into a world where everybody thinks the same way, you're going to develop the same habits. Think about this for a second. If you're born now, whatever you see around you, that's the world you live in, that's normal. That's why my children, my kids, are native digitals, and for them, technology is so simple, they just get it. It's intuitive. For me, I was born in the 1980s, in 1982 specifically. So for me, I was born in that transition between analog to digital technology, which is obviously way different than for my parents. They were born in pure analog, in a pure analog world, right? For them, technology is not as simple. Anything that is invented between, if you have 15 and 35, is exciting and you can adapt to it. But if something is invented after you're 35, your brain patterns are already set in. It takes you longer to understand anything that is new. That's why it's harder after a certain age to understand how society is evolving because you're used to society moving at a slower pace. And this is a challenge in today's world. So Peter Diamandis, talk about this in his book Abundance. He talks about a world where we're entering an era of superabundance. We're entering an era of an abundance of water, of food, of energy, health, education. But most people are not adapting to this reality as good and as easy as they should. Why? Because their mindset is not allowing them to adapt this way. So again, how do you deal with that? How do you deal with hyper-convergence in an era of superabundance, where technologies are built on a foundation that itself is built on a foundation that is changing incredibly fast? So again, let's go back to these 6 factors, right? We talk about high levels of agricultural productivity, remember? Well, now we have transgenic foods that are going to be allowing us to close the gap and take hundreds of millions of people out of hunger. That's it. 2050, if technology keeps advancing, hunger is out of the question. And again, I'm going to be talking about this in a purely optimistic way because, of course, there are many, many challenges. Now, since March 2020, it was established that if you want to develop a micro business, you need less than $5,000 in startup funding. This will eventually move to zero. You will only need an idea to launch a business. So now, especially after the pandemic, we saw a lot of people moving from the idea of I work for someone to the idea of I don't need to work for someone. I can launch my own thing. And many technologies were allowing them, especially no code technologies, allows people now to launch a website, launch something new, and create a better life for themselves without having to think about how do I sustain my family, because now I can do it with the knowledge that I have in just staying at home. And I'm myself an example of this, right? I used to have a company. And from there, I moved to only doing what I do now, which is way cheaper. Even as an entrepreneur, you're disrupting yourself. So that's very interesting. So let's keep moving. So, moving the production. The new river is now the sky, right? We have companies developing autonomous vehicles that are not only going to be moving production automated in an automated way through our roads, but also through our seas, through our rivers, and through the sky. Natural, natural resources, right? Think about this. The new, the new force is space. The future of humanity lies in space. So now we are becoming a multi-planetary species. SpaceX is going to have a human colony on Mars by 2050. This is impressive. Political stability. Countries with e-residency like Estonia, Portugal, we now, as an entrepreneur, can have a company wherever in the world without even having to move from our own country. And this is incredible. Okay? And then financial capital. Blockchain technology is allowing you to participate in a new way of crowdfunding your own innovation. So Web3, DeFi, NFTs, DAOs, we are hyper-converging and accelerating organizational infrastructure. So how do you prepare to leverage the future? First, develop a massive transformative purpose and align your organization resources with that. You need to develop a vision for the future that allows you to think, I want the world to look this way, and I want that world that is looking this way to, I want to build a world that is looking this way by aligning all my resources in that direction. Solve meaningful challenges for 1 billion or more people. Solve meaningful challenges for 1 million or more people. Even if you don't reach 1 billion people, what you're doing will force you to think in a way that it will be, you will need to develop a new canvas, right? You will need to completely think in a way to build that technology or that innovation and create solutions that use exponential technologies. Whatever you do, build on top of platforms that others are building, because that way you can move cheaper, better, and faster, okay? And then perform many experiments at the edge of your current business and of your imagination of what's possible. Perform many experiments. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Test ideas, test ideas, test ideas, and then move faster on top of those ideas. And finally, be bold and take risks. I want you to think about all that we've talked today. We've talked about the hyperconvergence of exponential technologies, and please share this with more people. Share this with the people that you think that can benefit from this conversation. Go to the comment section in Spotify, in YouTube, if you're whatever medium, and I want to engage with you. I want you to think about the future as a place where whatever you want to do, it's possible. Having said that, I want to thank you, all of you, for sharing this time with me today. And now I will leave you and thank you for sharing this first edition in English of Doulab Beyond. Thank you and talk soon.